Good morning. Good morning. And welcome to everyone who's on Zoom. My name is Sushma Raman. I'm the Executive Director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. It's really a privilege and an honor for me to welcome you to today's event, which really marks the academic launch of a new important study about disinformation in the Philippines. And this is a study that has implications not only for the Philippines, but that has regional and global resonance, particularly for democracies in the global south, but also for liberal democracies. This study is entitled Parallel Public Spheres Influence Operations in the 2022 Elections in the Philippines. Today, we'll hear from two of the five co-authors presenting key insights and an action plan moving forward, not only for researchers, but also global policymakers, national legislators, civil society, and the general public, including the many passionate and engaged people who are joining us via Zoom. Part of the mission here at the Kennedy School is to produce high-quality research that could have a direct impact on public policy and media practice. So we are especially honored that we have no less than Ms. Leni Robredo, former Vice President of the Philippines and Hauser Fellow here at Harvard Center for Public Leadership, to be part of the conversation. This study is published by the Media Manipulation Casebook, an initiative of the Technology and Social Change Project led by Dr. Joan Donovan at the Harvard Kennedy School. You can download the study from the website mediamanipulation.org, and this is the second of two reports on the Philippines published in the casebook. We invite you to check out the site and the many resources for digital investigations. Today's study and launch are generously supported by Internews, Luminate, and Reset. And this event is also supported by the Shorenstein Center, the Center for Public Leadership, and the Carr Center for Human Rights here at the Kennedy School. Without further ado, let me introduce today's speakers and what we can expect from them. Presenting a summary of the study is Shorenstein Center Fellow Dr. Jonathan Corpus Ong, who's also Associate Professor of Communications at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He's an engaged researcher who has authored pioneering research interviewing workers in the Philippines disinformation industry. He's joined by J.M. Lanuza, a PhD student at UMass Amherst, and co-author of a recent Internews study about TikTok and Filipino politics. Jonathan and JM will present for about 20 minutes. We are very honored that the Honorable Attorney Leni Robredo, former Vice President of the Philippines and currently Hauser Fellow at CPL, is the discussant of the report. She was given an advance copy of the report and will speak for 10 minutes. And finally, we have Dr. Joan Donovan, Research Director of the Shorenstein Center, globally recognized expert, and co author of the newly published book, Memoirs The Untold Story of the Online Battles Upending Democracy in America. And she'll have 10 minutes for synthesis, questions, and provocations. We'll have time for questions with attendees in person as well as on Zoom. And we are monitoring Zoom, so if you would like to drop any questions or comments in the Q&A box, we would welcome that. And now I call on Jonathan and JM. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It's a real honor to be here to present along with this incredible panel. Such an honor to present. And hello to the folks joining via Zoom. So, this report is a product of collaborative effort by 5 Filipino researchers. And we're especially proud that 3 of our collaborators are junior scholars in the Philippines. JM Lanuza, who is here today, but also Rosine Falarina and Ferdinand Sanchez II are early career academics. And so I think it really speaks to the criticality and the innovation of young Filipino scholars. Our co-author, Professor Nicole Curato, is based in Australia, and she is a specialist on public sphere responses to influence operations from the standpoint of deliberative democracy. Finally, I'd like to give credit to our artist, Tocua Peña Florida, for our cover art and infographics, and you can see it on screen. So this cover image for us illustrates the core argument of our study and the challenge we want to focus on, which is the cumulative impact of blatant disinformation and historical distortion over the past years and newer evasive forms of influence operations, which have now resulted in what we call parallel public spheres, where a society cannot agree on shared facts and people are unwilling to engage in civic debate. This is a personal story for many of us here in this room and for those in Zoom from the Philippines. And it has meant broken friendships, family relationships in this heated year of our election. So, as academics and educators, of course, the most rewarding part of our work is when our contributions get to have social and practical implications. Our research is grounded in sociological insight and deep respect of communities, acknowledging the real social and economic anxieties, but also recognizing their agency, responsibility, and sometimes their complicity with influence operations. That is why today we hold the academic launch of our study here in Harvard, recognizing that we Filipinos need to strategically align on policy at a global level. But we argue we shouldn't be dependent on global North policy frameworks alone. We need to offer sociological solutions that empower communities to address social problems at their roots. So next week, we will hold the public launch of our community engagement plan aimed at Filipino citizens. And we place our trust and support on new collaborators who can take forward our ideas we're presenting today and translate them into tangible solutions. Joan Donovan in this panel has long advocated for what she calls a whole of society approach to addressing misinformation, saying that we need an all hands on deck, all sectors of society contributing their diverse skill sets to addressing misinformation. And we believe this study in our community engagement plan is an attempt to manifest this for a specific country context. But the underlying study and story of the report that we're telling is also about these questions that you see on screen. So the report tells an underlying story of what happens when a vibrant grassroots political opposition's hopes are dashed by a stunning election result. What happens when activists and journalists are harassed and intimidated? What happens when people also cannot agree with how exactly to fight back? What are the backlash effects of fighting fire with fire? Is this a tenable and sustainable solution moving forward? It's a story about failures of listening and the need for more collaboration moving forward. So it's a meta discussion of what should we be doing? Should we be waiting for a global model, perhaps proposed by the US, or an EU model for tech policy, wait for it to flow down to the global south? Or should we provide more specific cultural touch points and opportunities for collaboration to address issues which are homegrown? And that's something that we touch on and reflect on throughout the report. So, this report is a meta commentary about this. What exactly does a whole of society approach look like in practice when people cannot agree? When people are frustrated, some are depressed and looking for answers. How can actors from the global south center our own concerns and advocacies in light of global inequalities, including in knowledge production? So, the argument of our team, myself and my collaborators, has consistently been the kinds of solutions that we can offer are really dependent on how we understand the problem to begin with. So, if we have only a superficial or abstract grasp of the problem or issue, that will lend itself to band aid solutions. For us to put up a good fight, we argue we really need to understand in depth what the enemy is and where they're coming from for us to muster a good fight. And that's where we argue for the importance of critical academic research. And so, thus, we offer our sociological and longitudinal analysis of disinformation in its main perpetrators. We've authored previous reports about the 2016 elections, the 2019 elections. We also did a comparative study of elections in Southeast Asia, a recent study by JM and co-authors on TikTok. We've interviewed and profiled trolls and disinfo operators in the Philippines, and we argue, right, that they're not who you think they are. So you can see some of these reports, and you can download them, and they're all on open access. So there's a scan me in that screen. So please feel free to access that. Again, it's open access. So, our latest study is entitled Parallel Public Spheres Influence Operations in the 2022 Philippine Elections. So, notice we're not using disinformation in the title, and this is very intentional and deliberate. We're trying to find a broader and more expansive framing of the problem. So, the term disinfo in the Philippines, and I say also most of the global south, has taken on a specific baggage. It calls to mind the fact checking of false claims, often attributed to online trolls. A lot of the energies have been invested in troll hunting, focused on unmasking anonymous operators on Twitter or naming and shaming vloggers on YouTube. The fact check centric approach to fighting misinformation has a lot to do with narrow funder agenda for global south civil society. So they want to transpose one model from one country to another, not to mention incentives designed by social media platforms themselves. Facebook or Meta funds three news outlets as its third party fact checkers in the Philippines, and civil society would tend to replicate those fact check models. So our use of the term influence operations, and we credit Alicia Wanless for our definition here. It refers to diverse strategic communications that aim for attention hacking and audience mobilization. Recognizing that the electoral campaigns of 2022, specifically, and the challenges to our information ecosystem, have gone beyond neat binaries of true versus false. They exploit regulatory gray areas of campaign finance, of influencer marketing, of social media policy, of advertising technology. They also exploit and toy with real feelings of grievances and anxieties of communities. And I'd like to turn it over to JM to reveal what we call the Rogues Gallery of 2022. Yes.
So, similar to our previous reports for the 2016 and the 2019 elections, we also have a rogues gallery for this year. We wanted to portray the new innovations or the new campaign strategies that we observed this election year. This year, we grouped them into three. So you can see the personalities, you have platforms, and then you have practices. Under personalities, we have knowledge influencers, we have a senator satirist. I mean, you get it, right? All the Filipinos here get it. And then we have a fan reactor or foreigners who are reacting on Philippine politics on YouTube. Under platforms, we have partisan broadcast media, and we also have TikTok. And then under practices, we observed an intensifying level of brigading and canceling. So, due to time constraints, we can only discuss three innovations that we observed. First is center setters. Um, it was a particularly new experience for the Philippines. We haven't observed this before, but now we see a sitting incumbent senator use her social media account, official platform to post professionally produced skits. Something new again, professionally produced skits where she role plays as a sassy tita or a sassy aunt, delivering real talk and spilling tea, but in the process, delivering coded attacks against VP Robredo. This campaign innovation evades fact checks. It evades social media takedowns. How do you take it down when it's not doing anything overtly malicious or wrong, right? Through its use of satire, through its use of its clout, because it's in an elected official's media page. We also bring up the extent to which content in official social media pages of elected officials evade campaign finance rules. So this is something that we haven't observed before. We also discuss the evolution of historical distortion as one of the four disinformation narratives that we've seen. If previous versions of historical distortion were expressed as crude memes or crude YouTube videos or artificially trending hashtags, now we're seeing new expressions come in the form of fictional entertainment, blockbuster movies, um, influencer collaborations, queer fan fiction. And these innovations are all being justified by credentialed knowledge influencers with PhDs. So this information production now is a full service, multi-tiered enterprise catering to multiple demographics. That's what we're seeing. So in our report, we discussed historical distortion as not simply a matter of falsehoods, but analyzing the strategic performance of false victimhood. It sounds like if our family has long been the victim of liberal elite politicians, of historians and journalists who have long suppressed the real truth about martial law, if our family, as powerful as it is, falls victim to that, what more the masses, what more you? That's what it's looking like. And so, to fight all of this, we saw various citizens, organizations, civil society respond creatively. We observed brigading, one. Um, our report documents the influence operation practice of brigading, where digital communities organize to mass report online campaigns. So you'll see people agreeing to a certain time where we go online, we scour the internet, and then we look for trolls and then we take them down. We mass report them. Brigading offers video game style thrills in bot busting and troll hunting of anonymous villains, quote unquote. And there's also canceling, where people organize campaigns to call out or withdraw support for celebrities, for influencers, or even for small businesses that directly or indirectly promote historical distortion. And while canceling itself is not new, the scale to which we're observing it is something that we haven't seen before, to the point where even if you're just an individual expressing your support, but using disinformation, you will find your place of employment being doxxed with complaints about you. So, brigading and canceling, we see, have served a critical role in the Philippine public sphere. They protect whatever spaces are left to defend historical truths and assert the presence of a political opposition. committed to holding the Marcoses and their allies accountable. But at the same time, these practices have also backfired. For Marcos supporters, these tactics only reinforce what they already know or what they've been fed for the longest time. The so called defenders of truth, human rights, these people are all bullies. These people are spiteful losers who cannot accept that they have been fooled by the liberal elite. So fighting fire with fire, it sounds sexy. Um, it may be the only tactic that some critics of the Marcos family have left. But if there's anything that can be learned from their operations, from the decades of Marcos restoration, it is that changing people's minds, it's a slow burn. So to address this, our report also designed a community engagement plan to be presented again by John.
So today we present you a community engagement plan. And this aims to be a blueprint, a starting point, a humble starting point for building new spaces for deliberation, learning, and political accountability. It's a recognition that living in parallel public spheres where people belong to separate information ecosystems is not sustainable for democratic problem solving. Addressing parallel public spheres also requires sociologically grounded insights, how to knit families and friendships together in difference. We think it's a hopeful plan. It recognizes that ordinary people are active agents capable of political deliberation. It rejects the disempowering premise that social media are totalizing forces that have brainwashed the so called uneducated masses. We present these recommendations as a starting point for us to pursue new collaborations, and we are offering startup funding for any individual or organization who might want to take any of these projects forward. And our recommendations will start with first, changing the narrative around disinformation. We argue that many digital literacy initiatives are guilty of perpetuating what we say are anti-masa or anti-poor sentiments when they should be empowering citizens. There's a tendency for some disinformation interventions to reinforce social class divisions. Usually, it's in the discourse of blaming the uneducated or those with cheap phones on free basics as the disinformers. We need to change this narrative. It directly plays into populist assumptions about elitist liberals and gives our enemies more ammunition for the information war. This is also, we say, inaccurate, as we have argued that the top trolls are actually elite entrepreneurs protected by politicians who also owe these people a debt of gratitude. So, what do we suggest? We are suggesting that we pivot to new storytelling projects, investigative journalism, and pre-bunking videos that punch up rather than down, those that would focus on political masterminds running the show or discussing social narratives rather than naming or shaming or in a kind of gotcha journalism approach. Second, of course, we're educators and we recognize the importance of making our materials more accessible and speak the language of communities that we really want to target and connect with. So we want to emphasize that we want to co-create an open access educational materials and make them available to communities. We seek collaborators to co-create an open access course that might curate all of these materials. I know Joan is a big fan of librarians and collaborating with librarians, and I think we need librarians to help us pool all of these sources together. Like we produce all of our materials, we have funders hosted on their websites or in our own pages. I think something more accessible that anyone could be um, uh, uh, could connect with, right? Would be something important. So next week we actually publish a Filipino translation of our report and translated by Elmer Gatchalian. So he's someone who volunteered to help our team during the election campaign season. he reached out to say, "Oh, have you translated your previous studies?" And we were like, "Well, thank you for volunteering. We haven't, right? But yeah." And he was like, "Yeah, here's my, that's exactly my skill set, and we want to make things more accessible to diverse ethno-linguistic groups, but also to different age groups. So here it's also not just lectures or quizzes, right? But very practical teaching guides. So I have been speaking with Phil Pro and Lisa Tanglao here, who's also interested in the idea of a conversation guide with a radicalized relative. How does that start? Like, should you have a third person as kind of like a buffer between you and your lolo, right? So those are important practical guides that people can use in everyday life. So third is supporting whistleblowers to expose disinfo for hire. The Philippines, along with many global South countries, we need to engage in uncomfortable discussions about worker ethics and justice in order to address our homegrown disinformation for hire industries. We need to introduce more pain points and accountability mechanisms that shed light on how local firms and local businesses profit from hateful campaigns and yet continue to operate as open industry secrets. For us, the first step is to create worker support and protection mechanisms, including legal protection for any whistleblower who might want to speak out about their workplace and their complicity with this info for hire. I have a collaboration with Puma Podcast, and I wanted to plug it here. Catch Me If You Can is one such experiment at normalizing discussions of ethics in the advertising and public relations industries. In each episode, we interview online operators and have them tell their stories about how they were recruited, how much they're getting paid. And the main theme here is also about morality. How do these people sleep at night, right? Like, how do they justify these practices and jobs to themselves? So, our podcast tells villain origin stories, not to name and shame any individual. In fact, we change their voices so that they won't be attributed, and there's a level of anonymity and protection there. But the challenge here is the aim here is to challenge misconceptions and to prevent other people from being recruited in the future. So you can see our episodes for season 2 includes Becky's in politics, an interview with an alter account, also trolls for Lenny, including a meme factory operator not hired by ma'am, but was actually hired by other people. So those are very interesting stories that are go beyond heroes versus villains. So we're inspired by other approaches, including by colleagues here in the global north. This is Nandini Jami, who is a co-founder of Check My Ads Institute, and her approach is making transparent digital advertising. And I think we're keen to follow the money trails, just like she does. We also suggest at a more local level to develop media buyer collectives, to present to these advertisers and media buyers. These are where your ads are going. Do you know exactly where your ads are being placed? Are they being placed on YouTube pages which are notorious for disinformation? So could we have those kinds of mechanisms that connect our research with advertising professionals? Fourth is south to south learning spaces. So moving beyond north to south policy flow dependencies, how can we learn from our colleagues in the global south? So a lot of our advocacies currently tend to replicate Euro American frames. And we instead would suggest to connect more with our southern colleagues that center our experiences of media censorship, of nationalist attacks, of lawcraft, including, smear campaigns against Western human rights principles, a theme that is shared by many of our colleagues here, coming from the global south. So we shouldn't be completely dependent on a US or EU model, but participate in more south to south learning spaces that bring us in direct conversation with our counterparts. So here on DigiLabor is one such portal that is hosting articles and research that are learning from different countries. So DigiLabor is hosted by our Brazilian colleagues. So it's about what can they learn from the Philippines experience and vice versa. So this is our final slide now. Our research team is looking for organizations and individuals who can take forward any of these recommendations. They include popularizing critical research, worker collectives, designing teaching materials, curating conversation guides that aim for depolarization, and studying ad tech in the Philippines. And again, we invite you here in the room, but also over on Zoom to connect with us. Community Engagement Plan 2022 at gmail.com. We'd like to end by saying these are concrete opportunities for collaboration, and we want to empower new voices in this space as well, rather than rely on the same individuals. Clearly, we have not found the solutions just yet, and we're excited on what other people can bring to the table. So we'd like to invite our other speakers to take forward also any of these suggestions, and we're excited to hear your feedback. Thank you so much.
We're delighted and honored to welcome Miss Leni Robredo to the podium to share her insights and reflections on the presentation of today's excellent and very timely report.
Thank you very much, Sushma. Um, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, JM, for the presentation. I've actually had a lot of conversations with Jonathan about this already, and a lot of Filipinos are here. Magpo-promote na po ako. Fan kami ng Catch Me If You Can podcast. To those who are watching online, it's a very good resource. Will give you a deep understanding of the motivations behind many of the operators of the trial machineries. Um, the study just presented to us confirms and reinforces what we observed and experienced firsthand during the 2022 campaign. That digital disinformation operations in the Philippines have achieved unprecedented levels of volume, of spread, of sophistication. Just as Jonathan said a while ago and JM said a while ago, this is not just simply disinformation, but it's creating a multiverse, another universe where facts and truth differ from the other. We have been at the receiving end of this well organized, obvious ba? Well organized, heavily funded campaigns of online disinformation and harassment since 2016. Just a while ago, I received an information that the latest news, this information about me was that I was kicked out after the first module. I'm sorry to say that I just had my second module yesterday and my last next week. So not at all true. The reason why I'm speaking before you is it is not true at all that I have been kicked out of the Harvard Kennedy School. But the expansion and intensification of these attacks into the national media space, yun yung, I don't know if this was discussed earlier, but this was in the study. It's not just shadow um, shadow troll machineries, but there's they've invaded national media already. If before it was just um, Facebook, Facebook at first, then Facebook and YouTube. Now JM has just said it's TikTok. Going into 2022, the use of the national media space, the use of other social media platforms has just made the challenge very, very daunting. I appreciate the term influence operations instead of disinformation operations, as it captures the broader ecosystem of shaping minds and hearts of people. So thank you for that. As I've said a little earlier, I am handling a course here at the Kennedy School on how institutional disinformation has given rise to populism. And the question often asked by students is why the public was so ready to believe the lies. That's the most common question. And we are reminded that for generations, I think Jonathan said this a while ago, we are reminded that for generations there existed an undercurrent of frustration against a system that has often served only the well-off, the well-educated, and the well-connected few. And the inability of our democratic systems over the years to diffuse power and impact the lives of our people in a manner that is significantly felt has created a political landscape that was ripe for capture by disinformationists in pursuit of their own agenda. It was the reason why we were so vulnerable. The frustrations made us so vulnerable. This fact became the staging ground for it became the staging ground or platform for the different disinformation tools and weapons that heightened the emotions of resentment, of anger, of cynicism among the marginalized majority who became vulnerable to populist propaganda and promises. And this is really the issue. This is really the issue that lies at the core of the challenge facing Philippine democracy today. What is the way forward? In a world where the common baseline of fact, parang term yun ni Barack Obama, the common baseline of fact, so essential for dialogue, cooperation, and accountability in a democracy, is deliberately being targeted and destroyed. The study makes clear that traditional fact checking, while important, is no longer enough, given the extent to which influencer operations have evolved. But we commend all the different organizations in the Philippines who are into fact checking because what they're doing is very important, but we should do more. In a similar vein, in platform responses that involve, as JM was mentioning a while ago, that involve ano yun, brigading, mass reporting, or canceling have proven to be ineffective. Considering that this comprise a significant bulk of current attempts to address this issue, it is clear that new approaches and responses must be identified and implemented as soon as possible. But I am pleased to note that the study sets out the beginnings of a clear path forward. So if you notice, it was not just a research, but there are actually very, very clear guidelines and recommendations on how to move forward. The proposed shift in emphasis from battling ground level trolls, which I think everyone is doing, to exposing the key architects of disinformation, many of whom are able to operate from within the security and respectability of the mainstream communications and creative industries, is one I find particularly compelling as it promotes a culture of transparency and accountability. I don't know if you've noticed for so long, most of us who want to battle the trolls, um, we battle those who are doing ground operations, but do not really shake up the people behind them. And it should be the other way around. Likewise, proposed efforts to popularize and make accessible education initiatives on influence operations and the nature of the digital ecosystem is, to my mind, crucial towards empowering citizens with the ability to effectively navigate the current information environment and effectively exercise their agency as democratic actors within the same. This is also a reminder to leaders of democracies all over the world, regardless of how young or advanced the democracy is, to always be mindful that it is only when the majority of the citizenry are properly listened to, taken care of, and empowered, can they be less vulnerable to manipulative influence operations of those that seek to disinform and deceive to achieve their own agenda. This challenge of empowering citizenry, of course, sabi nga ni JM, is not a marathon but a sprint. It is not a is not a is a marathon and not a sprint. Matagal talaga. So be patient. Other than politicized manipulative influence operations, there are other factors that cause roadblocks, that can cause setbacks to gains. This requires a lot of patience and determination. This is why I also endorse the idea of making values visible. That's proposal number 6. Making values visible, especially the points on the need to better at communicating our values, methods, and work processes, and the need to acknowledge ordinary people as agents and deliberative actors and engage them in conversations about why our methods, not our titles or institutions, deserve their trust. I think this is very important. Just to give you a very brief example, in my home city of Naga, south of Manila in the Philippines, I dare say that our electoral success there could be attributed to a large extent to our work in creating a People's Council, where we provide a real platform for our constituents to actively engage our local officials in all aspects of governance. An empowered citizenry makes transparency and accountability the norm. I am grateful that there's an increasing interest now all over the world in finding ways to fight disinformation. There's a diverse set of recommendations from many different viewpoints that are worth pursuing. I've discussed this with Jonathan already. That aside from the recommendations propounded in this study, there are other, JM discussed this earlier, there are other practices that we can replicate or maybe tweak to suit the environment in the Philippines. And as a final point, I would like to express my eagerness to be part of these efforts to find a way forward. One of the key initiatives that I have committed to advancing in my post-government life is precisely the effort to preserve the democratic ideals of dialogue, participation, and accountability in the face of the threat of influence operations. And to the Filipinos out there, we have fought so hard to win our democracy, and we will not give it up without all the fight that we can muster. So I am asking every one of you to join us in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presence and your wisdom and being part of this conversation. I'd like to now invite Dr. Joan Donovan, the formidable research director of the Shorenstein Center, who's really an expert in disinformation studies, to share her insights and her expert synthesis.
I am really impressed that everybody got here at 9:30, and this is probably the most well-dressed audience I've seen at Harvard Kennedy in in my tenure here. So I just want to say, y'all look good. Jonathan, especially that suit. Yeah, that suit. I got to say something about it. I'm sorry. Um, so this is an incredible report. I do want to get to Q&A because I think we really need to celebrate the authors in this incredible piece of research and leave room for people to ask questions about this really enormously important engagement plan, incredibly ambitious, something that the research that I've done over the years endeavors to do, which is really give the resources we need for public education campaigns, very broadly construed. And I think public education is something that we can all do. You don't have to be a professor to do public education. You just got to study a little bit and each one, reach one, teach one. And I think that having some resources to do that, building, I know that I'm going to continue to lift up critical research, especially the work that Jonathan puts in my inbox relentlessly. I appreciate that. And, you know, I think it's also important to point out how the way that Jonathan brings in early career researchers is something that I also strive to do. And this is really important to think about. I mainly co-author with people who are junior to me. And I do that as an ethic of research, which is to say that it would be much easier for me to get someone who's more senior, that, you know, has been around the block a few times. It's hard to mentor and bring up people when you're doing such critical work. And in the Philippines context, and this is the major point I want to make, is that doing this work, the resistance is both below and above you, right? And so the trolls and the people online that are trying to make their narratives and define the situation and grab hold of those hearts and minds and use the fact that people are energized and want to share and want to engage with information online, you're fighting against that tide. And those people are well resourced and they are unified and they are coordinating with each other either in WhatsApp groups or in other spaces online. And then you experience this pressure from above, which is this intense political pressure from people who really are the ones that are organizing this, that are using it to bolster their power, just as the former VP was just telling us. And then on top of that layer, you have the politics of platforms themselves. Facebook does not want us to be doing this research. Twitter, Google, a little bit more amenable to research, but ultimately they don't want anyone to know how dangerous their products really are. And they're going to use every lever of power that they can to shut down critical research or to buy out researchers. And so one of the other ethics that I've brought to the table, as others have, is that we need to craft our own methods. We need to get our own data. We need to do our own work. And this is where I think I'll leave it about the role of fact checking. Right now, fact checkers are critical because they are the ones shaping the future of the industry of content moderation. They are the ones adjudicating what counts as true and false on these platforms. One, because platforms figured out that they could offload their liability by paying a third-party actor. And as a result of that, you have these fact checkers that also don't want to, alarm the trolls from below or hurt the powers that be. And so even fact checkers are subject to this incredibly intense political pressure to stay in this mid-range, right? Where if we were to take a bit of a whole of society approach, that means thinking about civil society and public health and even the military and our politicians and our technologists. What can we all bring to the table to make the web we want? And I think even today, as Musk takes over Twitter, it's important to remember that the power of networks, it belongs to all of us, but it belongs to none of us alone. And what that means is that we have to get coordinated, we have to get organized, we have to use these resources that these foundations are putting out in order to do the public education to make sure that people are empowered by technology and not oppressed by it. And I really appreciate the work that everybody on this report has done, as well as every Filipino that has been living through this, either on the ground there or in the diaspora. Um, this really is the place in which we can learn the most about these influence operations, because of how open and available this disinfo industry is. So I will leave it at that. I'm very excited to promote this and make sure that everybody has the information that they need. And thank you again to the authors. Huge work.
So we're going to have time for a few brief questions, shaped in the form of a question with a question mark at the end. So we will invite a couple of folks, just given the interest of time, if you could share your name and your question at the mic so that folks on Zoom can hear your question. And ideally, the questions would be broad and could be answered by any of our speakers. So yes, I'd like to also hear from a woman. I learned this from Joan. So the person back there who raised their hand, that's you in the check shirt, yes. And then
Magandang umaga po. I'm Renzo Ginto. I flew all the way from St. Luke's Medical Center in the Philippines. I'm here for another conference, and I'm a Harvard Public Health alum. It's great to see all friends here. I have a question, and I alluded to my coming from the public health field. I mean, the vice president mentioned many sectors are now trying to fight misinformation. We in the medical community have been trying to do that during this pandemic. And I heard little about the relationship between what's happening in the political realm vis-a-vis the pandemic. And we know political misinformation can kill democracies, but medical misinformation can kill people's lives. So if you can just reflect on perhaps the interplay between political and pandemic misinformation in the context of the Philippines. And I really like your community engagement plan. You mentioned about digital literacy. I think we should also promote digital hygiene, especially when Musk takes over Twitter. I think it will be a less healthy place. Digital hygiene will also be good for our mental health. Thank you.
that's a great question. And I'm going to turn it over to see if either Jonathan, Joan, anyone here wants to respond. I don't think we'll have time for everyone to respond to this, but.
Hi, kay Renza. Thanks for that question. Renza, we came from the same school. Yeah, so early on in the pandemic, misinformation and policies by the government were used to structure communities, to limit communities, and that involved misinformation into handling the pandemic itself, handling the virus itself. We had presidents saying you can just like inhale or gargle gas or like just inhale steam. So I agree. We agree that definitely a big part or a big problem in the Philippines is health misinformation. I mean, we have people at the Philippine General Hospital terming it an infodemic, and other scholars globally as well. But at the same time, we think that these problems are coming from the same insecurities and from the same vulnerabilities in the system. So while we didn't explicitly mention these things, the community engagement plan that we put forward, I think, has built-in mechanisms that can partly address this. But at this, you mentioned this perfectly. We also need help from the medical sector, from the public health sector, more so because personally, I believe public health is the future. And the issue of COVID, the issue of this pandemic, it's a public health concern. It's not just a medical concern. It's not just a policy concern.
Just a quick shout out to Media Commoner. They did an engagement with us at UMass studying influencers during the time of COVID, tracking the good and the bad in terms of like influencers, shedding light on some of those issues.
Yes.
Magandang umaga rin po. I'm Carla Bautista from the House of Representatives Committee on Suffrage and Electoral Reforms of the Philippine Congress. And we have the huge honor of having our dear Attorney Leni Robredo as one of our members in the Committee on Suffrage in the 16th Congress. Dr. Ong, my question to you is that since I come from, I'm on leave right now, but I come from the House of Representatives, I am really interested in terms of your policy recommendations as to, all right, this study, Catch Me If You Can, the podcast, and all these studies would amount to something actionable in terms of legislation in the Philippines if we focus on, say, identifying um, the laws which may be amended such that we we inject that change. We start. I mean, we could start the change in a lot of fronts, but since we're talking legislation here, it would be wonderful if we get to formulate something out of these wonderful, huge studies that we are doing here so that we can find a champion or champions in the House of Representatives who are like minded, who will then author the resulting bills on whatever it is that we can come up with. Have you explored options?
In the interest of time, maybe we'll just take the third question from our gentleman who's been waiting so patiently. And I'm just wondering if I could actually get the questions from Zoom so that I could pick one, so then we could just.
Thank you. I'm Richard Chu. I'm a history faculty at UMass Boston. Um, my question is quite broad because when I was listening to, for example, the analysis of how people voted and how people are able to influence voters, as well as uh, what are some of the uh, suggestions on how we could change things. My question pertains to how about structural changes or approaches to understanding the situation? Like, have you looked at how the educational system in the Philippines currently has played a role in influencing the minds of people, and whether that should be changed? And secondly, in terms of the economy, what drives people really to vote? Is it, you mentioned frustrations, Vice President Robredo, that people have. Is it just a matter of being, for example, not having enough money, or is it poverty that drives people to vote for a certain way? And lastly, in terms of the democratic processes Jonathan, you mentioned about learning from our own experiences or from other global south. I think our own democratic system is patterned after the United States. Is there also something that needs to be changed in the way we vote or you know elect our officials? So these are really broad questions that look into culture, economy, and politics.
Thank you so much for your patience and your question. We also have a question from the audience on Zoom on the role of empathy. What role should empathy play in the ways in which we approach research? So I'm wondering, in the interest of time, if each of our speakers could provide one closing observation that could either connect to the three questions at hand or anything else that they've lifted up, and then I'll wrap it up. The 3 points were around the need for legislation or laws, policies that concretely address these issues, in addition to the sort of education and community awareness building. The second was around the need for structural changes and kind of more structural approaches to issues such as education, economic development, voting, democratic processes, and finally, the role of empathy in the ways in which we approach research.
I go first. Those are very broad Those are very broad questions. I'll try to answer in a very um, um, concrete and brief manner. With the first question, there are actually bills. There are actually bills being discussed now. I know one is being discussed by some of our colleagues in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. There's a bill that's focused on creating a social media governance council. I don't know if it's much like the one in India now, but I think it's being discussed. It's geared towards that. I know that there's been lobbying before the EU, the US, the UK to pass legislation to make social media networks accountable. But essentially, the bill being discussed now in the Philippines is, I think, very, very similar to what Jonathan and JM was pushing earlier, that we look at the people behind the operations and not waste our time with, the distributors of this information. Um, your question is broad, and but I must say that we have a lot to do. We have a lot to do as far as making sure that we are less vulnerable. You're a history professor, and I think that's one of the areas where we have failed. We have failed to teach history in a manner that would have prevented us from committing the same mistakes over and over again. Definitely education is key. Definitely economy is what is the root cause of all the frustrations that our people are experiencing. I'm not very sure about the structure, as I don't want to talk about anything that has not been studied. But definitely a lot of things are not working for us, and we should start talking about these things now, because it will only become worse if we wouldn't. The last question about empathy, I don't know if you heard me already talk about radical love during the campaign. A lot of people disagree with me, especially our supporters. They feel like radical love would not give us justice. But the reason why I've been pushing for radical love is we do not want to add to the polarization. By adding to the polarization, I'm very definite that we are not contributing to solving in a more sustainable way the problems that beset us now. So radical love is just exercising more empathy, listening more, being more patient. I think this research is an ethnological research that gives us a glimpse of the motivations behind why people do it. And I think it is very important when people feel that they're being listened to, when people feel that we are trying to understand where they're coming from, they will be more open to search for middle ground. But if we are not willing to listen, we are not willing to exercise empathy, then it will just contribute to the polarization.
First, for the structural questions from Sir Richard. Putting my political science hat on, I think we definitely have a lot to do in terms of structure. The Philippine political party system is very weak. It's very personality centric, and that incentivizes structures for disinformation for hire. So strengthening the party system and making it more programmatic rather than personalistic is one. Making it more inclusive in introducing a zipper system for representation where you have female, male, female, male. That makes it more inclusive. In the literature, there's also talk about halting or stopping the split ballot system. So you have the presidency and the vice presidency instead of in one ticket instead of voting separately. So these are things that are being discussed, but it's not prospering in the Philippines. I think we're too focused on presidential systems versus parliamentary systems and federalism. But that really, I think that really will not help us with a weak party system. So that's one of the things we can focus on. Regarding empathy and legislation, Jonathan and I are working on another project that actually touches on these. Um, we definitely think that legislation is one thing that we can benefit from, but at the same time, in the Philippine context, we issue caution. We want to issue caution. We need to be sober about our view because Jonathan has written about this elsewhere. In the Philippines, regulation is a bad word. The state is the biggest bad actor. So we want to be careful about introducing legislation that can potentially harm our freedoms. And there are some bills in the plenary right now that are targeting trolls, but how they define it is just you can simply tweet at a senator asking for explanations. It'll be qualified as a troll. It'll be taken down. So that's not nice. And how empathy figures into this approach is um, a lot of people were asking to fight fire with fire after the elections. And it's, like I said earlier, it's very sexy. It's very convenient. It's easy because you see the person in front of you, so you can cancel them immediately. But at the same time, this limits what steps we can do forward because it's a system, it's an entire industry. You need to take that down, not just individuals. You can replace another individual, but you cannot just replace a new system. So you need to make a new system. That's
And just to add to what JM said, around legislation. So there's a saying in the Philippines about our politicians being balat sibuyas. So like onion skinned. And so like a legislation is only developed or mustered like when politicians think they're the biggest victims of trolling, of harassment or whatever, right? Like they always play the victim card. And so I have personally been in legislative hearings where the politician centers themselves as the victims of fake news rather than right, rather than being culprits. And so that to me is always something that we need to exercise caution on. Also, we need to include in the discussion how do we protect including academic research from being misrepresented in some of these settings. So these are very risky endeavors in which academics and our works are being quoted and cited, but advancing a very partisan or even a misleading, yeah, that's not actually what we said. It's like you're twisting our words right now, but I don't want to call you out, Senator. You know, so that's a really tense situation that many academics, historians are facing. Um, in terms of empathy in the question from Zoom, just to say that I think connecting also with the point that Ma'am Robredo picked out from our report to make values visible. So the podcast that I wanted to promote and invite you to listen, here we platform perpetrators, right? And we present them to you not to absolve them or not to praise them or find them as exotic creatures, right? But actually invite judgment from listeners. Like, did that sound right to you? Are they actually sympathetic when they said that, or was there something fishy when it comes to them making a particular claim? So this approach is risky, right? Like to platform a perpetrator might be seen as you're absolving them, but for us, it's to prevent this kind of system from from continuing and actually understanding where they're coming from. So it's central to our research. Thank you.
Sorry, I was furiously taking notes. So I think I want to just close on reiterating what everybody here has just said, but particularly what JM said about individual actors can be replaced in a system. You have to think about this like a bureaucracy. So when we study influence operations, media manipulation, disinformation campaigns, we're always looking for what we call the ABCD of the campaign. So actors, behavior, content, design. And any regulation needs to come at the design of these platforms because you will chase these trolls or these actors or, the motivations are clear. It's power, profit, politics, and sometimes just chaos and fun. And so chasing the actors isn't good. Because it's not going to get to the bottom of things. It might upset their infrastructure for a couple of months or years, which I think is important work, but it's not the role of government. As well, chasing the behaviors. Are they using botnets, fake accounts? How are they doing this? Isn't going to stop us. That's the role that the platform companies should play in saying, does our product allow this behavior? And how can we redesign our product so that it doesn't? And then the content is such a, I mean, it's like a witch in a way. It can show up looking like so many different things. And much of the content that we look at that is disinformation isn't always wholly untrue. Sometimes there's a kernel of truth in it, but the facts and the context are being distorted. So going after individual pieces of content and flagging them is maintenance work in a lot of ways. And we see our social movements doing that day in and day out. So policy needs to get at the design. And I think that asking for companies not to scale beyond what they can enforce related to their own terms of service is going to be really important here. If you tell me your product does X and that you're going to provide community safety around these key categories like hate, incitement, harassment, you better be able to do that work. And if the claim is that the scale is out of hand, then we have to reduce the scale. And I think that that can be a role that government can play in how we understand the role of these platforms in our technological futures as well as in our political futures, because the internet belongs to all of us. And that's where the proper role of policy is.
This was a fabulous set of presentations and responses. I want to just close with 3 broad observations. Of course, there's so much we could delve into, and I think that the lessons from the Philippines could really be applied to many countries around the world, particularly countries in the global south. But the first thing I was really struck by was this notion of a whole of society approach, having a more expansive approach that takes into account the fact that we can't just think about disinformation in a narrow and technical manner. We really have to situate it within this broader ecosystem and understand that this parallel public sphere phenomenon is one that really is not sustainable for democracy and for societies around the world. The second theme that I heard was that there could be consequences unintended, perhaps, by our actions. For example, developing programs that perhaps inadvertently, marginalize already marginalized communities or blame them for the ways in which they are part of this ecosystem. So making sure that our efforts are in response to being squeezed from above and below really wants to frame this broader set of values to identify ways in which to approach these issues with empathy and to be inclusive is really, really important to change hearts and minds. And the third theme, which I wanted to lift up coming from a human rights center, is the need for human rights to really be integrated at the start. It's really hard once you've had actions that result in disinformation, even activities that lead up to genocide in many countries, and then sort of revisiting the actions of platforms, of various actors in the space. Could we think about ways in which human rights could be integrated into the design and deployment of these technologies upfront so that we can ensure that people's rights, dignities are respected from the outset? So once again, thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to our audience on Zoom and to each of you for joining us today.